They wore crowns, gave speeches, and signed treaties, then stumbled back to their chambers reeking of port and poor decisions. Behind palace walls, the British monarchy wasn't just a lineage. It was a legacy of hangovers, broken glasses, and brandy before breakfast. This is the story they don't include in coronation ceremonies. 25 royals who drank not just for pleasure, but to cope, to vanish, to rage. Some drank in secret. Others drank in public. All of them drank too much. And no, it didn't stop with the Tudors. Welcome to 25 British royals who were drunk all the time. Before we dive glass first into centuries of royal intoxication, make sure you're subscribed, especially if morally questionable monarchs are your thing. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? Because nothing pairs better with royal misadventure than knowing someone across the globe is listening with you, probably with a drink in hand. 1. King Edward II, England. It's not easy being a medieval monarch. The food is undercooked, the shoes are pointy, and everyone wants to kill you, especially your own wife. But if you're King Edward II of England, you handle all that pressure the way any self-respecting Plantagenet would, by sneaking out to local taverns and getting thoroughly plastered. Edward II ruled from 1307 to 1327, and during that time, he managed to offend Parliament, alienate the barons, lose Scotland, and turn the royal court into something that looked suspiciously like a boys-only drinking club. Chroniclers accused him of being ill-suited to governance, which is medieval historian code for he was drunk, distracted, and in questionable company. Edward was not a warlike king. He wasn't even particularly interested in governing. What he was interested in, besides a suspiciously intimate relationship with Piers Gaveston, was pleasure. And pleasure, in Edward's England, came with a tankard in one hand and a torch-lit party under the rafters of some low-born alehouse. Which was a problem, because kings weren't supposed to be seen there, especially not sloshed, and especially not being carried out. To the barons who loathed him, Edward's drinking was just another symbol of his incompetence. But it wasn't just his enemies spreading rumors. Even neutral observers noticed the king's tendency to sneak away from royal duties to drink among the commoners. Picture it. A monarch disguised in simple garb, sitting elbow to elbow with peasants, downing ale like a man trying to forget he accidentally started a civil war, which, to be fair, he eventually did. Edward's passion for low company was scandalous, but it was also dangerous. The medieval English throne was not exactly nailed to the floor. You had to work hard to keep it. And Edward's work ethic was somewhere between woeful and let's outsource that. He preferred to spend nights feasting, drinking, and disappearing into what chroniclers delicately called indiscretions. By morning, he'd emerge hungover, indifferent, and occasionally missing important national documents. There are reports, admittedly, some of them gleefully biased, that Edward would hold private revels that made the Roman emperors look tame. Guests were handpicked. Wine flowed endlessly. Protocol was not invited. In one letter, a baron complained that Edward's court had abandoned the dignity of rule in favor of something more like a rolling tavern. He wasn't exaggerating. Of course, we can't talk about Edward without mentioning Gaveston. Piers Gaveston wasn't just Edward's favorite courtier. He was a lightning rod for scandal. The two were inseparable. Lavish gifts, suspicious titles, late-night parties. When Gaveston was exiled, Edward sulked, drank more, and wrote long, moody letters until he could bring him back. It was all very medieval boy band breakup energy, except with more political consequences and more goblets of wine shattered against castle walls. Even after Gaveston's brutal execution by nobles who'd had enough, Edward didn't change course. He just found new favorites, threw more parties, and dug himself deeper into infamy. He ignored Parliament, drank through council meetings, and reportedly fell asleep at major state functions, when he bothered to show up. It's easy to blame the drink, but maybe the truth was worse. He simply didn't care. And then there's Isabella, his queen. Known later as the she-wolf of France, she was beautiful, clever, and utterly disgusted with her husband. She watched Edward squander power, dignity, and sobriety, while clinging to disloyal companions and goblets of spiced wine. By the end, even Isabella, queen consort, royal partner, mother of his heir, couldn't take it anymore. She allied with her lover Roger Mortimer, invaded England, and overthrew her husband in 1327. Edward was imprisoned, forced to abdicate in favor of his son, and, depending on which version you believe, met a grotesque and possibly apocryphal death involving a red-hot poker. But here's the thing. Even that infamous story, true or not, was soaked in symbolism. The downfall of a man who let his appetites, his indulgences, his dependencies, his distractions, consume his kingdom. What's truly unsettling isn't just Edward's drinking, but how eerily modern it feels. A leader who avoids responsibility, disappears into nightlife, surrounds himself with sycophants, and lets governance crumble while the music plays and the wine flows. It's easy to laugh. It's even easier to forget how much damage one drunk monarch can do. But don't get too comfortable. Edward was just the start. The monarchy has a long memory, but an even longer bar tab. And the next royal on our list? He turned victory into hangovers and left his enemies defeated, then drank with them afterward. 2. King Edward IV, England. If you asked the average Englishman in the 15th century what a king was supposed to look like, he'd probably describe something suspiciously close to Edward IV. Tall, broad-shouldered, golden-haired, with a face made for statues and a body built for armor. He was the kind of monarch who could ride into battle, win decisively, then ride out again, directly into a wine-soaked banquet that lasted until someone fell off a chair. Usually him. Edward IV wasn't just a drinker. He was a celebrator, a monarch who treated victory not as a strategic gain, but as a personal excuse to unleash an all-night rager. And with him, the line between celebration and dependency started to blur early and often. Crowned in the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, Edward's first instinct upon seizing power wasn't to consolidate authority or establish reforms. It was to throw a lavish feast. In fact, multiple feasts. One noble complained that Edward's reign was becoming a series of entertainments disguised as policy. He wasn't far off. For Edward, politics was a party. And parties, of course, required wine. Edward's appetite, both culinary and alcoholic, was legendary. He drank like a man trying to outlive a prophecy. Records of his court show purchases of immense quantities of imported wine, strong ale, and exotic liquors from southern Europe. This wasn't just royal indulgence, it was gluttony on a state-sponsored scale. At his coronation banquet in 1461, chroniclers estimated that over 600 gallons of wine were consumed. Some of that, of course, went to guests. But Edward himself was rarely seen without a goblet in hand. And the stories of him drunkenly serenading his mistresses or challenging his nobles to wine-drinking contests weren't just court gossip. They were part of the royal atmosphere. The man could charm almost anyone while drunk. His charisma didn't disappear under the influence. It metastasized. Edward was known to hold entire court sessions half inebriated, laughing through legal discussions and casually pardoning prisoners in moments of alcohol-fueled goodwill, which might explain how so many of his enemies ended up mysteriously reinstated. Until, of course, they turned on him again. But beneath the charm was volatility. Edward's drinking seemed to mirror his political mood swings. When triumphant, he drank to celebrate. When betrayed, he drank to forget. When in exile, which happened more than once, He drank because he had nothing left but a claim and a bottle. In 1470, after a reversal of fortune forced him to flee to Burgundy, Edward reportedly drowned his humiliation in local taverns. Disguised and broke, he traveled through unfamiliar territory with only a small band of loyalists, and an apparently unshakable desire to find the nearest wine cellar. According to one letter, Edward was found in a village alehouse, holding court with strangers, waxing poetic about betrayal while double-fisting goblets of Dutch gin. The monarchy, ladies and gentlemen. But here's where the story takes a turn. Most kings, when exiled, stay defeated. Not Edward. He sobered up just long enough to orchestrate a political comeback that ended with him reclaiming the throne, executing his traitors, and, predictably, throwing another multi-day drinking festival that nearly bankrupted the crown. One chronicler described it as the merriest vengeance God hath ever permitted. Edward, grinning in his golden robes, raised a toast to betrayal, and then likely forgot all about it by the next morning. There's a tragic irony to all this. Edward IV was no fool. He was intelligent, multilingual, a skilled military tactician. He could have been one of England's great reformer kings. But his reign was defined less by what he built and more by what he consumed: land, trust, loyalty, and barrels upon barrels of French wine. By the 1470s, his health was visibly deteriorating. He gained weight, his moods worsened, and his notorious night feasts became more frequent and less joyful. Some suspected depression, others whispered about the long-term effects of his constant drinking. Whatever the case, by 1483, he was dead at just 40 years old. The official cause was illness. Unofficially, a lifetime of excess catching up with him. The man had tried to outdrink history, and history, as always, had the last word. But before the grave, before the kingdom unraveled into war again, there was still one more bottle uncorked, one more toast to make, one more night to pretend that the crown was weightless and life could be laughed off. The crown, of course, was never weightless, and history wasn't laughing. Still, Edward left behind a legacy, not of policy or peace, but of the kind of royal who could charm you into forgetting how doomed the monarchy already was. His sons would vanish, his brother would usurp, his dynasty would shatter. But at least there'd be wine. And speaking of monarchs who drank as if their crown came with a corkscrew, the next in line didn't just toast to power. He weaponized it. A man whose thirst for domination was matched only by his thirst for, well, everything else. And that's just the first two royals on our long, staggering descent through royal inebriation. 19 more to go, and each one makes the last look like a warm-up act. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. It's the only royal duty we'll ever ask of you. And let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you in bed at 3 a.m. questioning the monarchy? Or halfway through your lunch break wondering how much brandy is too much? Either way, we're just getting started. 3. King Henry VIII, England. There's something about King Henry VIII that resists understatement. He was large, physically, politically, historically, and emotionally. Everything he did with operatic flair. He didn't just marry, he remarried. He didn't just break from the church, he invented a new one. And when it came to drinking, he didn't merely indulge, he orchestrated a royal lifestyle soaked in alcohol, structured like a banquet, and maintained like a hangover that lasted 4 decades. If Edward IV was the charming drunk who turned political chaos into a party, Henry VIII was the imperial drunk, the kind of man who expected the wine to flow not because he was thirsty, but because he was divine. By all accounts, Henry wasn't born a brawler or a drunkard. As a young man, he was athletic, educated, and even temperate. But power ferments quickly. Once he ascended the throne in 1509, The boyish charm was rapidly fermented into something darker, heavier, and thirstier. His court, like his appetites, ballooned in scale. Massive banquets, endless feasts, nightly revels. It was a kingdom where the kitchen ran 24/7 and the wine cellars were considered strategic assets. We know this not from rumor, but from royal household records meticulously kept by bureaucrats too sober to lie. They show an endless parade of barrels: Gascon claret, Spanish sherry, German Riesling, English ale by the literal ton. Henry imported entire boatloads of alcohol annually, ostensibly for his court. But let's not kid ourselves. Alcohol was so embedded in daily court life that even breakfast often came with ale or wine. Water was considered dangerous, true, but no one else was pairing poached quail eggs with Burgundy at 8 a.m. quite like the King of England. And then came the entertainments. Picture this: Henry, post-hunt, red-faced, laughing too loud, slamming down goblets of spiced wine while watching dancers in silk and pageantry on full feverish display. He didn't just watch jousts, he entered them. Didn't just host feasts, he ate until his gold-threaded tunics had to be cut open. All of it, soaked in drink. By the 1530s, the young king had become the colossus of royal myth, choleric, paranoid, often ill-tempered, and increasingly drunk. Foreign ambassadors took careful note. A Venetian envoy once wrote that Henry's court was merrier than Rome and drunker than Venice. Even for Renaissance standards, that was a diplomatic burn. But his drinking wasn't just a courtly indulgence. It was a crutch, a mood regulator, a weapon. There were times when decisions of state seemed to hinge on whether the king had been drinking ale or sack that day. He could be gregarious, even generous, until the mood turned. Then came the paranoia, the erratic decisions, the rage, and through it all, more wine. Henry's relationship with alcohol mirrored his relationships with people: intense, possessive, and ultimately destructive. Advisors he once toasted at banquets ended up imprisoned, or worse. Wives he once wooed with roses and Riesling were soon discarded, if they were lucky. As Henry aged, so did the darkness behind the merriment. His body, once the athletic pride of Christendom, grew bloated. He suffered from ulcers, gout, and chronic pain, all worsened by his excessive drinking. Doctors begged him to reduce his intake. He didn't. Instead, he surrounded himself with flatterers who assured him the wine was medicinal, the brandy good for circulation. In one particularly infamous account, Henry berated a physician who suggested temperance by reminding him, loudly, that kings are not monks, nor should they drink like ones. But perhaps the most revealing glimpse into Henry's drinking comes not from a feast or a festival, but from his private chambers. Toward the end of his life, he was often bedridden. Servants wheeled him between rooms, and even then they were instructed to ensure his goblet was never empty. Wine was poured as though it were sacred, as if the king's blood itself needed fortification. When he died in 1547, the kingdom did not mourn a peaceful monarch. It mourned a fractured church, a bankrupt treasury, a body count of courtiers, and a lingering sense that beneath the music, the dancing, and the endless wine, Henry VIII had been consumed by his own appetites. The drinking wasn't the cause. It was the mirror. The reflection of a man who couldn't stop taking, from others, from his people, from history. And yet no one dared stop him, because to stop the king's wine was to stop the king's will, and kings like Henry didn't dry out. They burned out. But if you thought Henry drank like a tyrant, just wait for the queen who followed. Exiled, scandalized, and wrapped in gossip as tight as her bodice, her royal evenings didn't end with prayers. They ended with something much stronger. 4. Mary, Queen of Scots, Scotland. There's a kind of romantic mythology that clings to Mary, Queen of Scots. Maybe it's the tragic arc, a queen at 6 days old, imprisoned in her prime, executed at 44. Or maybe it's the portraits, delicate, melancholic, crowned in velvet and pearls. But somewhere beneath the embroidery lies a more human story, one not written in court poetry or martyrdom, but in letters, whispers, and goblets of claret passed around in candlelit despair. Mary was born in 1542, baptized into chaos, and married off by the time most of us would be learning how to form opinions. She was fluent in French, Catholic in a Protestant country, and beautiful in a world that treated beauty like both a currency and a curse. And through it all, through marriages, miscarriages, conspiracies, and captivity, she drank. Now, did she drink excessively? The official biographies will sidestep that question politely. But the unofficial ones, the letters from guards, the gossip of courtiers, the memoirs of those who knew her, suggest something else entirely. They paint a picture not of a queen addicted to alcohol in the clinical sense, but of a woman who turned to it, repeatedly, methodically, as her kingdom, her alliances, and her identity dissolved around her. It started, perhaps, in France. Mary was just a teenager when she married the sickly Francis II. The French court, lavish and predatory, introduced her to a world of luxurious coping mechanisms, perfumed rooms, political masks, and endless wine. To survive, there required poise, charm, and a certain tolerance for excess. She acquired all three. By the time she returned to Scotland as a widow at 18, she carried with her not just a French accent but a French appetite, for finery, for escape, and for the rich, dark wines of the continent. And Scotland, gray and grim and aggressively Presbyterian, did not approve. Her courtiers frowned. The ministers lectured. But Mary went on, quietly raising her glass in a country that barely tolerated her throne. Her second husband, Lord Darnley, was charming, treacherous, and already halfway into the bottle himself. Their marriage collapsed in record time, helped along by infidelity, intrigue, and yes, more than a few wine-drenched arguments. Contemporary reports describe late-night shouting matches that echoed through Holyrood House, followed by long silences and the clinking of cups. After Darnley's murder, an explosion that was suspiciously convenient for everyone except Mary, she married the man many suspected of orchestrating it, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. He was brutish, scandalous, and unpopular, and their union all but destroyed her public image. What followed was rebellion, abdication, and 19 years of imprisonment in England. And that's when the drinking seems to have become ritual. Mary was held in various castles and manor houses under the watchful eye of Elizabeth I's nobles. It was a gilded cage, warm, fires, embroidery frames, books, but a cage nonetheless. And behind the tapestries, the years piled on. Her health declined, her correspondence grew darker, and the wine kept coming. Some of her wardens noted it discreetly in their letters, how Mary insisted on French reds, how her hands trembled in the morning but steadied after lunch, how her moods would lift, momentarily, after an evening toast. One lady-in-waiting described the queen as having a fondness for the grape that recalls her younger days, a euphemism as sharp as it was elegant. To be clear, this wasn't debauchery. It was something quieter, more unsettling. Mary didn't drink to celebrate. She drank to remember, or maybe to forget. She drank as a way of punctuating the sameness of the days, of clawing back some semblance of control in a life defined by loss. And isn't that the cruelest irony? That the woman who once ruled Scotland, who once danced in the halls of the Louvre, who once signed treaties and commanded armies, was reduced to marking time by the bottle, not with revelry, but with resignation. Even in her final days, awaiting execution at Fotheringhay Castle, Mary maintained her rituals. She dressed with dignity. She wrote final letters with precise Catholic conviction. And at her last supper, yes, it's recorded, she drank wine. Not much. Just enough. The chroniclers wrote about her martyrdom, her courage, her Catholic fortitude. But in the quieter margins of those accounts, you can still find the woman beneath the crown. A queen who watched her world crumble one goblet at a time. Not with drama, but with that slow, tragic, utterly human kind of unraveling. And yet Mary wasn't the only Stuart to blur brilliance with intoxication. Her son, James, heir to both her tragedy and Elizabeth's throne, would inherit more than just kingdoms. He'd inherit the same taste for escape, only he didn't hide it behind veils and velvet. He wore it like a second crown. 5. King James VI and I, Scotland and England. By the time James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, he had already survived multiple assassination attempts, political coups, and enough Protestant Catholic tension to sour a monastery. He had outlived his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, and inherited not only her crown, but some of her more persistent habits. One of them, noted with increasing concern by his English courtiers, was an enduring fondness for strong drink. But James didn't drink like his mother. Mary's drinking had been quiet, ceremonial, laced with grief. James's was far less poetic and far more theatrical. If Mary drank to forget, James drank to perform. This was a man who believed in absolutism, divine right, and the medicinal powers of sack wine. He was highly intelligent, fluent in Latin and theology, fond of debate, capable of holding court both intellectually and literally. But he was also a king who staggered out of banquets slurring philosophical arguments, declared foreign policy stances after midnight to an audience of intoxicated sycophants, and openly mocked the Puritans while half-soused. To understand James's drinking, you have to understand his court. It was chaotic. His English subjects, especially the starchy aristocrats of Elizabeth's generation, had been used to the severe, cultivated sobriety of the Virgin Queen. They now found themselves in the middle of what felt more like a Jacobean frat house. Protocol slipped, manners frayed. The wine bills quadrupled. James brought with him a retinue of Scottish favorites, many of whom shared his taste for heavy drink and loud late-night debate. The English nobles hated them. The Scots thought the English were uptight. And James? He held court with a goblet in one hand and a stream of half-jesting decrees in the other. One ambassador described him as a man whose thoughts are clearer by day, but whose tongue moves freer by night. By all accounts, James was a social drinker. Gregarious, long-winded, prone to both philosophical tangents and poorly timed jokes when deep in his cups. But his socializing could get unpredictable. He was infamous for touching his courtiers too much, for making crude remarks, for derailing formal dinners with inappropriate stories and unsolicited lectures about monarchy, witchcraft, or whatever else was fermenting in his mind that day. And while the court rolled its eyes, foreign diplomats were less amused. Reports from Spanish and French envoys describe a monarch who often reeked of wine, whose speeches veered into incomprehensible, and whose fondness for alcohol made serious diplomatic negotiation a delicate and shifting task. One Venetian ambassador warned his superiors to schedule meetings in the early hours when the king is more inclined toward clarity. Still, for all his drunken oddities, James was no fool. He was a skilled political operator. He united England and Scotland. He survived the gunpowder plot. He avoided the religious wars that engulfed Europe. But even his successes were regularly punctuated by his reputation as a ruler who could be brilliant at sunrise and bumbling by dusk. One of the more peculiar patterns in James's life was his belief in moderation, as a theory. He wrote extensively about personal restraint. In his treatise Basilicon Doron, he lectured his son on the dangers of overindulgence, warning that drunkenness was unseemly for a prince. And yet, within the same decade, he was being carried out of royal feasts after toasting every member of his hunting party by name, and then forgetting half of them by the end. This contradiction became one of James's defining traits. He was a king who preached temperance and practiced excess, who spoke with theological precision by morning and barked jokes in a brogue-thick slurry by evening, who believed deeply in the moral clarity of kingship, but rarely applied that clarity to his own personal habits. By his later years, the drinking had taken a visible toll. His health deteriorated, his speech grew slower, his gait unsteady. But the feasts continued. So did the after-dinners, and the hangovers that conveniently coincided with difficult parliamentary sessions. And yet, his court stayed loyal. Partly because he was affable, and partly because the line between eccentricity and power is often blurred by fear. To mock the king's slurring was to risk exile, or worse, to be forced into a wine-fueled theological argument with him in public. When he died in 1625, he left behind a mixed legacy, one of peace, of union, of literary patronage, and of revelry. The King James Bible bore his name. So did half the taverns in London. And behind both was a monarch who proved that intellect and inebriation are not mutually exclusive, but are rarely a sustainable cocktail. And as for his son, the Crown Prince Henry, he was supposed to be different. The great hope, the sober one, the future. Except Henry didn't live long enough to wear the crown. But he did live long enough to drink like one. 6. Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, son of James I. There's a cruel kind of poetry in royal succession. The ones who seem best suited to rule are often the ones history keeps on a short leash. And few figures embody that better than Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, the golden-haired, fiercely Protestant, sword-wielding heir of King James I. He was supposed to be the future. Instead, he became a royal what-if, immortalized not by the policies he passed, but by the stories of how hard and how often he partied before death had a chance to ruin his reign. Born in 1594, Henry was everything his father wasn't. Where James was fussy, Henry was bold. Where James meandered through drunken lectures, Henry galloped through jousting tournaments. Where James babbled on about divine right after dinner, Henry was out in the courtyard, sword fighting with half of his household staff, and then treating them to a round of drinks afterward. He was England's adolescent Apollo, a prince of promise, constantly accompanied by the sound of clanking armor, hearty laughter, and the unmistakable pour of vintage claret. Even as a teenager, Henry made clear that he had no patience for his father's reputation as an eccentric tippler. He would loudly mock James's slurred speeches in private, sometimes even mimicking his father's drunken gait to his friends' amusement. He promised his court he would usher in an era of military strength, moral clarity, and youthful vigor. But here's the irony. The very prince who vowed to bring sobriety back to the throne was already drinking himself into legend. You see, Henry didn't drink like his father. James drank to debate. Henry drank to dominate. His drinking wasn't about sloppiness or evasion. It was about exuberance, bravado, and the exhausting need to prove that he could out-everything everyone around him. Out-fence them, out-hunt them, outride them, out-drink them. By the time he turned 16, his inner circle had become a tightly curated fraternity of young nobles, soldiers, poets, and foreign adventurers. These weren't idle courtiers. They were rowdy, romantic, and most of all, thirsty. They followed Henry through hunts and tournaments, and they followed him to the tables, where ale, sack, and strong French reds were poured with the unspoken understanding that pacing yourself was for peasants. Reports from the time tell of extravagant late-night gatherings in his personal apartments at St. James's Palace. One guest described a scene where Henry challenged 3 courtiers to keep up with him, first in swordplay, then in storytelling, and finally in the kingly art of consumption. 2 passed out. The 3rd vomited. Henry laughed and poured another round. It was more than youthful mischief. It was branding. Henry wanted everyone to know he wasn't just going to inherit the crown. He was going to embody it, viscerally, physically, lavishly. And if his charisma didn't get your attention, the size of his wine bill would. But even as he drank, he dazzled. He invested in naval development, advocated for military reform, patronized scientists and artists, and even proposed sending Protestant colonies to challenge Spanish dominance overseas. He made friends with Protestant nobles across Europe who whispered that with Henry on the throne, England might rise again, not just as a trading power, but as a beacon of modern monarchy. He was preparing for a long rule. History, however, had other ideas. In 1612, at just 18, Henry fell suddenly ill. Rumors swirled, poison, plague, divine punishment, but most agree it was likely typhoid fever. The sickness was swift. The decline was brutal. And the image of this radiant, hard-drinking prince fading into a fever dream unsettled the entire kingdom. People wept in the streets. Merchants wore black. Poets wrote odes to a monarch who never ruled. And somewhere in the quiet, his wine cups sat untouched for the first time. But what did he leave behind? Not reforms, not wars, not treaties. What lingered were the tales of the prince who seemed larger than his title, who lived like a comet, and who burned out before he could light the throne. His death left a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped his younger brother Charles, who would become King Charles I, and eventually spiral into civil war, rebellion, and the executioner's block. It's hard not to wonder, if Henry had lived, would history have been different? Or would the same court that toasted his vigor have eventually watched him drown in it? We'll never know. That's the cost of legends. They leave behind no facts, only fragments and wine-stained myths. But the Stuart lineage had more drinkers to give. After all, Henry was just the rehearsal. The real show, the roaring, reckless, brandy-soaked spectacle, was about to begin. Because the next man wasn't just drunk on power. He was drunk on everything. 7. King Charles II, England and Scotland. The restoration of the English monarchy in 1660 was supposed to bring stability, dignity, and divine right back to the throne. Instead, it brought Charles II, a man who treated England like a half-broken theater set and ruled it like a ringleader in a never-ending masquerade. He was witty, charming, cynical, debauched, politically elusive, and quite possibly tipsy for most of his reign. After nearly 2 decades of civil war, regicide, and Puritan rule, the return of Charles felt like a national exhale. No more somber sermons, no more canceled Christmases. The king had come back, and with him came wine, theater, music, gambling, mistresses, and a royal household that operated more like an aristocratic cabaret than a center of government. Charles had spent much of his formative years in exile, drifting from one European court to another, mostly in France and the Low Countries. He had no kingdom, no real income, and no shortage of expensive habits. So he learned how to survive the way many exiled nobles did, through charm, subterfuge, and never saying no to a drink. By the time he returned to England, he didn't just have a taste for alcohol, he had a continental philosophy about it. And that philosophy went something like this. If the Puritans hated it, it was probably fun. Almost immediately, Charles reopened the theaters, filled the court with lords who could outdance their wives, and began hosting some of the most legendary parties in European history. The Restoration Court quickly became infamous across the continent for its excess, boisterous dinners, week-long feasts, masked balls, drunken poetry readings, and private concerts where sobriety was not on the guest list. Charles didn't just enjoy drinking, he institutionalized it. Wine was more than a beverage at his court. It was a social lubricant, a diplomatic tool, and sometimes a distraction from his deeper political inertia. Foreign ambassadors noted that audiences with the king often began in the evening, long after the wine had started flowing, and that the king preferred conversation to policy, wit to legislation. One French diplomat observed that, The king's interest in treaties is as steady as his hand after supper. It wasn't just wine either. Charles had a particular fondness for brandy, imported from France in increasingly absurd quantities. His court records show entire cellars dedicated to its storage. He even appointed a royal yeoman of the wine cellar, whose job, quite literally, was to ensure the king never had to wait for his next glass. And while the court celebrated, the country wobbled. Plague swept through London in 1665. A year later, the Great Fire consumed half the city. The Dutch War sputtered, then flared. Parliament muttered, the treasury drained. But Charles, unflappable, half-drunk and always grinning, sailed through it all like a man who believed reality was optional. When asked about the collapse of various royal plans, Charles is reported to have said, "Better to be merry than miserable," before returning to a late-night card game fueled by French wine and terrible wagers. Even his physical body seemed to absorb the effects of constant drinking and merrymaking. He aged oddly, sometimes bloated, sometimes skeletal, always somehow resisting the traditional look of a monarch. He looked more like a man who hadn't slept in years, and didn't particularly want to. But make no mistake, Charles was clever. He knew exactly how to maintain power in an age that didn't trust kings. His answer? Disarm them with a party. Behind every diplomatic stalemate, there was a mask. Behind every political scandal, a fountain of Madeira. When ministers failed, he shrugged. When lovers betrayed him, he wrote them poetry. When enemies plotted, he raised a glass and waited them out. Cynical, charming, and rarely sober. His mistresses were as famous as his ministers. His illegitimate children outnumbered his policies. His dogs had titles. His wine had budgets. And yet, the people loved him, or at least they loved him more than the Puritans. Charles's reign didn't end in disaster, but it didn't end in triumph either. When he died in 1685, it was sudden. Collapsed at his bedside. Some said apoplexy. Others blamed years of indulgence. But in his final moments, he reportedly turned to his gathered attendants and muttered, "I'm sorry, gentlemen. I'm such a long time dying." A punchline till the end. What remains of Charles II isn't law or legacy, but atmosphere. A sense of glittering, wine-scented misrule. He didn't restore monarchy, he rebranded it. Not as sacred duty, but as performance art. He drank not to forget the war, but to ensure everyone else did. But not everyone followed the script. His brother James, who took the throne next, drank too, but not with laughter. With bitterness, with exile in his bones. And the bottle in his hand wasn't a prop, it was ballast. 8. King James II, England, Scotland, Ireland. There's something unsettling about watching a man drink like he's trying to outlast the weight of history. King James II did not sip wine with flair or toast to merriment with his courtiers. He drank the way soldiers march, grimly, stubbornly, and as if there were no other way forward. And maybe for James there wasn't. By the time he took the throne in 1685, the monarchy had already been dragged through rebellion, execution, restoration, fire, plague, foreign wars, and a decade-long party hosted by his older brother, Charles II. Where Charles had ruled with laughter, women, and fountains of wine, James stepped into power with a stiff jaw, a Protestant nation on edge, and a bottle of port never too far from reach. He wasn't supposed to charm anyone. He didn't try. James was the stern one, the soldier, the Catholic, the convert. He had fought in wars, survived exile, and returned to a throne that barely wanted him. His courtiers called him cold. His ministers called him difficult. His enemies called him dangerous. And behind all that, quietly but persistently, rumors of his drinking began to circulate. To understand James's relationship with alcohol, you have to look at his long years in exile. After his father, Charles I, was executed by Parliament in 1649, James, then just a teenage prince, fled to France, where he grew up in the shadow of loss, Catholicism, and French brandy. The French court offered refuge but no shortage of humiliations. There he learned to drink not as performance, but as ritual. France at the time was swimming in fortified wines and strong spirits, and James quickly acquired a taste for both. The difference was, unlike his brother, he never made drinking look easy. There were no midnight poems, no jovial games, no sparkling banter. Just slow, steady consumption. Sometimes with friends, sometimes alone, almost always in silence. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, James returned with him, bearing all the signs of a man who had watched too many dreams die overseas. He took up the role of Duke of York, commanded the Royal Navy, and drank steadily through both success and scandal. One particular scandal, his public conversion to Catholicism, would define the rest of his life and reign. England, still haunted by religious wars and papist conspiracies, viewed the move as a betrayal. Parliament resisted, the people grew restless, and James, caught between his faith and his kingdom, seemed to drink more and trust less. By the time he officially became king in 1685, James II was already exhausted. His court was smaller, colder, more rigid than Charles's. Gone were the music, the masks, the wine-fueled debates. In their place came sermons, suspicion, and long, tense dinners where the king drank glass after glass of port, with the solemn focus of a man trying to stay upright in a collapsing room. Observers noted his preference for strong drink, especially while in private. One nobleman, after visiting court in 1686, described the king as aloof by day, but increasingly melancholic by evening, when he sips his port with the posture of a confessor. Not exactly the glowing review monarchs hoped for, but there was method in the melancholy. James saw himself as a martyr in waiting, a righteous king in a corrupt land, besieged by enemies foreign and domestic. He believed he had been chosen, by God, not Parliament, and that God would vindicate him. In the meantime, the port helped dull the noise. It did not dull reality. In 1688, just 3 years into his reign, James was deposed in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. His daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange sailed in with the support of Parliament and ousted him with barely a fight. James fled to France once more, his second exile. It was there, in the court of Louis XIV, that his drinking reportedly deepened. No longer king, no longer powerful, James became something else entirely. A man with a title but no throne, a court but no kingdom. He established a sad little mirror court at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, where loyal Jacobites toasted to his inevitable return, and watched their monarch slowly pickle himself in port. He lived out the rest of his days in ceremonial irrelevance, haunted by visions of divine monarchy, and occasionally lifted only by the predictable comfort of his evening glass. To the French, he was a relic. To the English, a warning. And to his own followers, a fading hope drowned one sip at a time. James died in 1701, still clinging to the belief that he had been right all along. History disagreed. It tends to. But his legacy lingered, in pamphlets, in prayers, in bottles. Because if Charles II drank like a king who had survived the fire, James II drank like a man trying to put it out with his own hands. And wine, mostly wine. But as England shifted into a new century and a new royal line, not every monarch would mourn like James. The next one? She didn't wallow. She reigned. She drank her way through personal loss, political disaster, and 17 pregnancies, with brandy in the bloodstream and Parliament at her heels. 9. Queen Anne, England, Scotland, Ireland. She was England's last Stuart monarch, the first officially crowned Queen of Great Britain, and the kind of woman history likes to smother in either pity or parody. Queen Anne. frail, indecisive, constantly pregnant, perpetually grieving. But behind the mourning gowns and trembling signatures was something else, something historians often sidestep with a nervous footnote. A queen who, according to multiple contemporaries, spent a great deal of her reign with a glass of brandy not far from reach. Not in celebration, not in triumph, in endurance. Anne's reign, 1702 to 1714, was marked by contradiction. A growing empire led by a physically declining monarch. She suffered from chronic illness, gout, painful swelling, and relentless personal tragedy. 17 pregnancies, only 5 live births, and only one child who lived past infancy, Prince William, who died at age 11. With every funeral came another dose of medicine, and with the medicine often came the drink. At first it was subtle. Anne had always suffered from fragile health, and doctors in the early 18th century had a solution for everything. Alcohol, brandy for nerves, wine for digestion, gin for female complaints, port for circulation. It was the age of liquid medicine, and Anne's court physicians were practically licensed bartenders. The brandy was prescribed at first, and then it became habit. Court records show regular and large purchases of French brandy, even during wartime embargoes. When questioned, the justification was medical necessity. After all, the queen was unwell, and besides, she needed comfort in times of war and personal distress. But that comfort became conspicuous. Visitors noticed. So did foreign ambassadors, who noted her slurred speech during private audiences and her diminishing daylight stamina. One courtier, in a private letter, described her as warmed by brandy and dimmed by grief. It wasn't the theatrical drunkenness of Charles II or the stoic despair of James II. It was something more resigned. Anne didn't drink to escape the throne. She drank to endure it. Parliament was difficult, the cabinet was factional, and her own power was slipping, piece by piece, signature by signature. She was caught in the middle of a growing storm between Whigs and Tories, between her close confidant Sarah Churchill and the shifting expectations of monarchy in an increasingly constitutional world. The days of divine right were evaporating. The crown was becoming an institution rather than a personality. And Anne, soft-spoken, frequently ill, and increasingly isolated, was not built to weather the shift without assistance. So she reached for what steadied her. Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough and Anne's closest friend, turned political nemesis, wrote scathingly in her memoirs about Anne's dependence on drink. She claimed the Queen would often arrive late to meetings clouded by drink, and that her judgments were softened and muddled by the bottle. Was this political spite? Perhaps, but other accounts echo the same sentiment, often more gently. The Queen grew more tired, more withdrawn, more reliant on the private ritual of evening brandy as her reign progressed. She was deeply religious, loyal to the Church of England, and always outwardly dignified. There were no scandals, no public collapses. But behind the heavy curtains of Kensington and St. James's, Anne's days followed a rhythm dictated less by sovereign will and more by chronic pain, emotional trauma, and the quiet clink of glass behind closed doors. Her body bore the weight of it all, literally. She became increasingly immobile, often carried in a sedan chair from chamber to chamber, her legs so swollen she could barely stand. The brandy remained constant, a companion, a balm, a slow, sticky form of surrender. And yet, through it all, she ruled. Under her reign, the Acts of Union were passed, uniting England and Scotland into a single kingdom. The War of the Spanish Succession dragged on under her watch. Marlborough triumphed on the battlefield. Trade expanded. The empire grew. All while Anne presided from behind her veils, her medicine cabinet, and the haze of everything she had lost. She died in 1714, aged just 49, but appearing much older, physically diminished, politically cornered, and emotionally exhausted. Her death marked the end of the Stuart line and the beginning of a new Hanoverian dynasty that would shift the monarchy even further into figurehead territory. There was no final toast, no last banquet, no witty last words, just silence, state mourning, and a reputation forever caught between tragedy and ridicule. But the next royal in line for our purposes, he would pick up where Anne left off, but without the restraint. Because while Anne drank in private and in pain, he drank publicly, proudly, and to excess. A man who didn't just guzzle brandy, he weaponized it against his liver, his waistline, and sometimes Parliament itself. 10. King George IV, England. If monarchy is theater, then King George IV was both lead actor and worst critic, flouncing across the stage of British history in silk, sequins, and a state of permanent intoxication. He wasn't just a heavy drinker, he was one of the most notorious alcoholics to ever sit on a European throne. And that's saying something, considering how many crowns have gone down with the ship, and a decanter. George didn't sneak his drinking past the footman. He didn't swill in private or pour in moments of grief. He drank like a man who believed it was a divine right, and by the time he finally ascended the throne in 1820, after decades as Prince of Wales and then Prince Regent, his bloodstream was practically vintage port. Let's go back to the beginning. George Augustus Frederick was born in 1762, the eldest son of King George III, the same George III who would eventually descend into mental illness and lose America in the process. From the start, George IV seemed determined to be everything his father wasn't. Flamboyant instead of austere, indulgent instead of restrained, and above all, allergic to self-discipline. By the time he turned 18, George was already a legend in the making at London's gentlemen's clubs. Brooks's, White's, Boodle's. He frequented them all, usually with a glass of claret in one hand and a scandal unfolding in the other. Champagne breakfast became a signature move. A light lunch could involve 3 courses and a magnum of Madeira. And evenings? Well, evenings were for 3-piece suits, political grievances, and oceans of brandy. At court, his reputation preceded him. His debts spiraled. Estimates placed them at around £650,000 in the late 1780s, tens of millions today, and much of that went toward food, fashion, gambling, and alcohol. Parliament bailed him out, reluctantly, and only on the condition that he would marry a Protestant princess. Enter Caroline of Brunswick, a woman he reportedly met while drunk and hated immediately. Their wedding night ended in disaster. He was too inebriated to consummate the marriage, though not too inebriated, apparently, to sleep on the floor. Their mutual hatred became one of the most public marital breakdowns in British royal history. George spent most of the next few decades avoiding her, and most of that time drinking with increasing desperation. When Caroline returned to England during his coronation and tried to claim her rights as queen, he had guards physically block her from Westminster Abbey. And then, of course, he threw a lavish coronation party without her, one that lasted days and featured wine fountains, dessert temples, and an astonishing amount of spilled brandy. As Prince Regent, 1811 to 1820, George was effectively king in everything but name, thanks to his father's mental decline. During this time, his lifestyle reached new depths, or, depending on your perspective, new heights of absurdity. He was obese, often unable to walk without assistance, but still insisted on tight breeches and elaborate military uniforms stitched together with diplomatic fictions and actual gold thread. His gout was so severe that he often held court from a wheeled chair, feet wrapped in silk, a glass of fortified wine nearby for the pain. He claimed it was medicinal. He also claimed he could not survive without turtle soup and 5 bottles of wine a day. His physicians pleaded with him to stop. Ministers quietly suggested moderation. Even his personal staff began leaving notes. delicately phrased reminders not to mix champagne with laudanum or brandy with morphine. He ignored all of them. If anything, he doubled down. He once told a servant, "I have lived with style, and I shall die with flavor." A toast to irony. And yet, George wasn't stupid. Beneath the wig powder and liquor haze was a man who understood the spectacle of monarchy. He patronized the arts, founded what would become the National Gallery, and built the Brighton Pavilion, a bizarre, dazzling, domed monument to his personal taste, funded largely through debt and drowned in imported wine. By the time he was finally crowned king in 1820, he was a bloated shadow of the dashing prince he once pretended to be. His health was failing, his bladder was swollen to grotesque proportions. From what? Take a wild guess. And his breath reportedly smelled like a rotting orchard drowned in brandy. He rarely appeared in public without some sort of liquid courage. And when he did, he was either unrecognizable or barely coherent. He died in 1830, riddled with illness and more than a little forgotten. His death was not mourned as a great loss. The Times wrote simply, "There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king." A sobering footnote to a life lived without sobriety. But George left behind more than unpaid debts and empty wine cellars. He left a legacy of royal excess so extreme it forced Parliament to reconsider the public image of the monarchy entirely. The Victorian age, chaste, somber, tea-fueled, wasn't just a cultural shift. It was a royal detox. That said, not everyone in George's family tree got the memo. Because while he drank in full view, laughing through the collapse, the next royal in line drank more discreetly, but just as hard, and just as often. 11. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, son of George III. It's hard to be the second son of a mad king and the brother of a flamboyant drunk who thinks champagne counts as breakfast. That's the role Prince Frederick, Duke of York, was born into. A man forever in the middle of someone else's story, except when he was accidentally the punchline. And like so many British royals backed into existential corners, he found a way to cope. By drinking. A lot. Frederick was born in 1763, just a year after his brother George, the future George IV, and it quickly became clear that while George was destined for infamy, Frederick would be assigned something slightly less glamorous: responsibility. Not actual power, just the ceremonial image-polishing kind that required him to show up in uniform, not embarrass the crown, and occasionally pretend to command an army. Spoiler: he managed about 2 out of 3. As the second son of George III, Frederick was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, a title he held for most of his adult life, despite a military record that could be politely described as sporadic and less politely described as several miles south of competent. His one actual campaign in the field, the Flanders Campaign of 1793–94, ended in retreat, ridicule, and a lot of very drunk officers trying to explain how they lost to the French. Frederick, of course, led by example. He was reportedly quite drunk himself. Still, if you were looking for a general who could organize a wine cellar, Frederick was your man. Contemporary accounts consistently reference his fondness for alcohol, particularly port, sherry, and brandy. His dinners were legendary, multi-course, drawn-out affairs, where the toasts began early and ended only when no one could remember who was being toasted. It was the kind of drinking culture that relied heavily on formality. Raise your glass, say something patriotic, swallow something imported, and repeat. Over and over. Until history lost interest. Frederick's reputation for intoxication wasn't scandalous in the traditional sense. It was routine. His colleagues in the military joked that if the French ever attacked during a royal dinner, Britain might be conquered before dessert. Satirical poems and cartoons began to appear depicting him as a corpulent figure in uniform, swaying on his heels, sword in one hand and bottle in the other. If Charles II had been the merry monarch, Frederick was the sleepy general, always toasting to victory, rarely delivering it. And then there was the matter of the infamous nursery rhyme. You probably know it. The grand old Duke of York. He had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill, and he marched them down again. That's him. That's Frederick, a man who became a literal children's rhyme for pointless military movement and indecisive leadership. The rhyme wasn't just about tactical failure, it was about public perception. Frederick, through a haze of port and poorly executed parades, had become a symbol of absurd royal inertia. And still he drank. But for all the mockery, there's a darker undertone to Frederick's drinking. It wasn't merely revelry, it was, arguably, self-medication. The man lived in a deeply dysfunctional family, led a military he couldn't reform fast enough, and watched as his older brother turned the monarchy into a cartoon. Meanwhile, their father, the once stalwart George III, was unraveling mentally, plagued by illness and isolation. Frederick had to watch that collapse up close, and in public. The crown was disintegrating into madness and mockery, and Frederick, half sober in the corner of yet another failing institution, had no script for how to respond. So he drank. Even as commander-in-chief, Frederick's tenure was marked by long dinners, slow mornings, and the smell of spilled claret in his correspondence chambers. There are letters, perfectly formal, impeccably phrased, but smudged with ink and suspiciously late, written in what one aide diplomatically described as a hand less precise than usual. And yet, Frederick wasn't entirely useless. Despite his reputation, he actually did oversee important military reforms, particularly around discipline and administration. He introduced measures to reduce corruption in the army and improve officer training. But his achievements were constantly overshadowed by the caricature. The overweight prince with a flushed face and a glass that never emptied. The man who could organize a table better than a battlefield. He died in 1827 at the age of 63 after years of illness, including gout and other ailments worsened by his lifestyle. There were no riots in the streets, no poetic farewells, just a few dry obituaries, a nursery rhyme echoing faintly in the background, and the quiet retirement of a man who drank his way into the footnotes. And if Frederick was the royal who drank his failures into forgettable farce, the next one would take the naval route, literally. A prince turned king who brought the culture of sailors to the royal court, and never once showed up sober enough to explain why. 12. Prince William, Duke of Clarence, later William IV. They called him the Sailor King, but not for his naval strategy, or his victories at sea, or his ability to command a fleet. No, Prince William, Duke of Clarence, the man who would later become King William IV, earned his nickname the old-fashioned way, by spending decades in the Royal Navy, drinking like a sailor, cursing like one, and eventually, ruling Britain like one too. Born in 1765, William was the third son of King George III, which meant he was close enough to power to matter, but far enough from the throne to be ignored, at least for a while. Unlike his older brothers George and Frederick, William was not sent into politics or the church. He was packed off to sea at 13, commissioned as a midshipman in the Royal Navy. And it was there, far from the powdered halls of court, that William found his calling, not in strategy or statecraft, but in brawling, boasting, and drinking the officers under the table. Naval life in the late 18th century was brutal, grimy, and soaked in rum. Sailors drank not just for pleasure, but for survival. Alcohol preserved morale, masked disease, and softened the horror of days spent knee-deep in salt water and human misery. William didn't just adapt to this world, he reveled in it. He made friends with his crewmates, swore like the bosun, and drank like a man who didn't plan to remember the morning. By the time he was 20, he was a living contradiction. A prince by birth, a barroom regular by reputation. At one point, he requested active duty in the American Revolutionary War, not out of patriotism, but because he was bored in Britain and fancied more tavern nights in Charleston. The request was denied, but the legend grew. William's naval career eventually sputtered out, not from lack of interest, but from a total lack of discipline. He rose in rank more from bloodline than merit, and his drinking became something of a diplomatic risk. There were whispers that foreign dignitaries were embarrassed to host him. He insulted officers, forgot names, and made speeches that began with patriotic fervor and ended with slurred singing. And yet, somehow, he remained likable. His crew loved him, his fellow officers tolerated him, and the public, weirdly enough, admired him. He returned to England in his 30s, unofficially retired and very officially disheveled. There, he set up court in Bushy House, though court is a generous term. What he established was closer to a drunken domestic sitcom. He lived openly with an Irish actress named Dorothea Jordan, with whom he had 10 illegitimate children, all surnamed Fitzclarence. He once tried to convince Parliament to give them titles. Parliament for once declined. The pair hosted endless informal gatherings, loud, relaxed, and absolutely soaked in alcohol. Ministers visiting the Duke of Clarence often found themselves trapped in long, rambling monologues about naval life, interrupted only by more port or unexpected renditions of sea shanties. It was like visiting a pub with its own coat of arms. When William finally married, at age 52, it wasn't for love. It was damage control. After Dorothea left, or was gently pushed aside, he married Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, a sweet-tempered German royal who reportedly spent most of her time trying to keep William out of the brandy. She failed. Even after marriage, William's drinking didn't slow. His staff knew not to expect clarity after supper, and his political allies learned to schedule meetings in the early morning, when the fog had lifted and he was, temporarily, lucid. By the time he unexpectedly became king in 1830, after the deaths of his older brothers left the throne vacant, he was in his 60s, red-faced, overweight, and somehow still more popular than his scandal-ridden predecessor. And here's the twist. William, despite the booze and the blunders, wasn't a bad king. He hated pomp, rejected court protocol, and insisted on walking around his palace in slippers. He was unpredictable, stubborn, and prone to shouting at ministers. But he cared about the country, about reform, and weirdly, about the working class. He supported the Reform Act of 1832, which expanded voting rights and shifted Britain toward a more democratic system. He did it clumsily, grumpily, and likely half drunk, but he did it. Still, his drinking remained a fixture of royal life. He held receptions where guests whispered about the smell of sherry on his breath. He gave toasts that wandered into rants. And he died in 1837 after a brief illness, still insisting he was fine, still drinking with his usual defiance, and still, miraculously, liked by much of the nation. William IV was not regal. He was not polished. He was not even particularly coherent. But he was real, honest in a weird way. A man who stumbled into kingship with a hangover and somehow left it more stable than he found it. But if William brought the sailor's bar to the palace, the next royal would mix something else entirely. Military discipline and deep insecurity, poured over port and served in a crystal glass. Because what happens when a man obsessed with order can't quite control his own drinking? You get a duke with medals on his chest and wine on his breath. 13. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, father of Queen Victoria. Before he was the father of Britain's longest reigning monarch, before he passed down the Hanoverian nose and the stiff upper spine, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathern, was a paradox in a red coat. He was a man of rigid discipline and rigid habits, of military punctuality and private indulgence. He drilled soldiers like clockwork, lectured his brothers on their laziness, and championed duty in public. But behind closed doors, there was the bottle, port in particular, and often in quantities that would send a less disciplined man into early retirement. Born in 1767, Edward was the fourth son of King George III, and like his brother William, the future William IV, he was dispatched into the military not so much out of a sense of destiny, but out of necessity. There were only so many royal titles to go around, and George III believed in two things with papal certainty: Protestantism and strict, relentless structure. So Edward was raised in that image, woken at dawn, schooled in harsh continental academies, shipped off to foreign outposts before he'd finished growing into his jawline. His early years in the army took him far from England and into the heart of British imperial expansion. He served in Gibraltar, Canada, and the Caribbean, developing a reputation for harshness bordering on cruelty. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he was stationed for several years, his soldiers referred to him behind his back as the tyrant of the garrison. He punished infractions with a severity that startled even veteran officers. One soldier was sentenced to 900 lashes for drunkenness. 900. That's not discipline, that's obsession. But here's where things start to crack. While Edward kept his soldiers bone sober and iron-marched, he himself was known, quietly, discreetly but undeniably, to indulge in nightly sessions with his beloved port wine. Not raucous, not sloppy, but habitual, steady, almost medicinal. He called it his evening comfort, and the phrase became a knowing euphemism among his staff. Port was the drink of British officers, sweet, fortified, and deeply colonial. It symbolized prestige, masculinity, and old-world entitlement. For Edward, it was also a coping mechanism. His life was one long exercise in being the other brother, not the heir, not the charming one, not the celebrated naval prince. Just Edward, precise, severe, and constantly stationed somewhere inconvenient. Even in Canada, far from court, he built himself a miniature kingdom of routine: inspections at dawn, reports by noon, punishment parades by afternoon, and port at dusk. Always port. His consumption was never wild enough to draw scandal, but always just present enough that those around him adjusted their expectations accordingly. He was known to grow more talkative as the evening wore on, still formal, still guarded, but with the edges slightly dulled. His contradictions mounted as he aged. He was deeply involved in charitable work, supported Catholic emancipation before it was popular, and advocated for modernization within the army. Yet he remained personally cold, emotionally distant, and chronically anxious. In letters to his aides, there's a consistent thread of complaint about the press, about his brothers, about being underappreciated by Parliament. And beneath it all, you can sense a man who poured as much of his life into his glass as he did into his legacy. By the early 1800s, Edward had returned to Britain permanently. Still without a legitimate heir, and still without a permanent role at court, he began living with, and later married, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a widowed German princess who brought with her an existing child and, eventually, a new one, a daughter named Alexandrina Victoria, born in 1819. Finally, Edward had a purpose: to raise the future queen. But fate, as usual, had its own schedule. In 1820, just 8 months after Victoria's birth, Edward died suddenly of pneumonia, or possibly complications worsened by years of accumulated health issues. He was 52. The timing was cruel. His daughter was too young to know him, his wife too new to mourn him publicly, and his legacy too complicated for easy tribute. He left behind little in terms of political impact. His military reforms were eclipsed by others, his charity work forgotten by all but the recipients. But in private, among soldiers, servants, and a handful of friends, he was remembered with a strange mix of respect and frustration. The man who flogged soldiers for drinking, then retired to his study for a glass of port. The prince who lived by regulation yet found solace in routine intoxication. And so the story of Prince Edward became another minor royal paradox. Another man who held others to impossible standards while quietly slipping beneath his own. His daughter would go on to define an entire era, rule an empire, and become a symbol of moral restraint. But behind her, just one generation back, was a father who drank alone, and often, because service and structure weren't quite enough. But the contradictions didn't end there. The next royal in line took Edward's taste for alcohol and stripped it of any pretension. He wasn't a moralist. He wasn't even English for long. He was chaos in cavalry boots, and when he drank, London heard about it. 14. Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, later King of Hanover. Among the many sons of George III, Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, was arguably the most controversial. Not because he ruled poorly, though that's debatable, or because he drank excessively, which he did, but because he combined the two with a grim, unapologetic sneer. While his brother William IV blustered through life like a drunken sailor with a heart of gold, Ernest drank like a man preparing for a siege, calculating, disciplined in his chaos, and ready to bite whoever judged him for it. Born in 1771, Ernest was the fifth son of George III, and early on, it was clear he didn't have the charisma of George IV, the affability of William IV, or even the brutal efficiency of Prince Edward. What he had instead was ambition, a short fuse, a long memory, and a talent for becoming the least liked man in every room he entered. He pursued a military career, of course. All good surplus royals did, and he distinguished himself in name only. His actual campaigns were limited. He suffered a facial wound while serving in the Low Countries, which he would later reference with exaggerated flair, as though every scar were a badge of martyrdom. And in the social circles of London and later Hanover, he behaved like a man permanently convinced the world was against him, which, to be fair, it often was. Because Ernest had a reputation, not the kind passed along in court gossip or fluffed by sympathetic biographers, the kind that appeared in parliamentary debates, satirical pamphlets, and court whisperings too consistent to ignore. He was widely regarded as reactionary, cruel, and paranoid, and he drank accordingly. Unlike the flamboyant drinking of his brother George IV, champagne-fueled, waistline-expanding, almost theatrical, Ernest's drinking was something else, private, aggressive, and wrapped in bitterness. His drink of choice was reportedly fortified wine, port and sherry, usually, though some accounts say he favored strong brandies in later life. And while he wasn't a public drunk in the caricature sense, he was a court drunk, the kind who kept a bottle in his study, poured before meetings, and whose moods changed by the hour depending on what and how much he had consumed. Contemporaries wrote about his dark humors and intemperate disposition, often noting how his conversations became more volatile as the evening wore on. He was known to be argumentative at dinners, prone to launching into political tirades or icy monologues about loyalty and treason. The kind of man who drank not to forget, but to fortify his opinions, his suspicions, his ironclad belief in his own moral correctness. And then there were the scandals. To say Ernest Augustus was unpopular is to undersell it dramatically. He was accused, though never legally convicted, of multiple serious crimes, including violence and intimidation. Some of the accusations were later dismissed as politically motivated slander. Others stuck. Whether or not he committed the crimes, his behavior encouraged the gossip. He was aggressive, often drunk, and deeply paranoid. He once accused his own staff of plotting against him and had them dismissed en masse after an evening of wine-soaked paranoia. His drinking was not the cause of his character, but it certainly didn't help. And yet, in the strangest twist of royal irony, Ernest became a king. When his niece Queen Victoria inherited the British throne in 1837, she could not inherit the Kingdom of Hanover, due to Salic law, which barred women from ruling. As the next eligible male heir, Ernest became King of Hanover, and promptly moved to Germany to take the crown. The British sighed in relief. The Hanoverians didn't. As king, Ernest Augustus ruled Hanover with the same suspicious energy he brought to London. He cracked down on liberal movements, dismissed political opponents, and, according to letters from his court, hosted stiff, uncomfortable dinners punctuated by sharp remarks and generous pours. German ministers remarked privately that the king seemed preloaded before meetings, and that his breath often betrayed the kind of night that makes policy dangerous. Still, he was competent enough to avoid total disaster. His reign in Hanover was regressive but stable. He focused on preserving monarchical authority, limiting democratic reforms, and ensuring that no one in his court ever forgot who had the last word. When he died in 1851, he was largely unmourned in Britain. To the English public, he was the creepy uncle who finally moved out. To Hanover, he was the stern foreign king who drank too much and trusted no one. To his family, he was a problem finally solved by geography. But his legacy lingered, not in legislation, but in cautionary tales. Ernest Augustus reminded the British monarchy what happens when unchecked power meets unchecked bitterness, and then tries to drown it all in a barrel of port. He wasn't charming. He wasn't tragic. He was just a hard man who drank hard and ruled harder. And if Ernest drank like a man preparing for political apocalypse, his younger brother Augustus, yes, another one, drank like a man who thought politics could be solved with toasts and tailcoats. One was fear. The next was flair. 15. Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex. There's always one in every royal family, the odd one out. The sibling who doesn't quite fit the mold, doesn't chase the crown, and doesn't seem particularly troubled by scandal. For the sprawling dysfunctional clan of King George III, that was Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, known to some as the liberal prince and to others as the Bohemian Duke. Augustus didn't throw tantrums like George IV or lash out like Ernest Augustus. He threw parties and opinions, and quite frequently back glasses of champagne like it was a cure for monarchy itself. Born in 1773, Augustus was the sixth son of George III and never anywhere near the throne, and that's exactly how he liked it. With zero chance of being king and no appetite for military life, which had been the family default, Augustus struck out on his own path, studying abroad, dabbling in theology and Freemasonry, collecting books, marrying illegally, and, of course, drinking more or less constantly through it all. His royal relatives called him eccentric. Courtiers called him charming. Servants, one suspects, just called him thirsty. From early adulthood, Augustus was known for his fondness for lively conversation, political idealism, and liquid hospitality. He wasn't a binge drinker in the violent or erratic sense. He was a habitual social drinker, a man who never turned down a flute of champagne, especially when accompanied by good company and long philosophical arguments. He kept one of the most interesting households of his generation. Intellectuals, reformers, scientists, and society's uninvited were all welcome in his drawing rooms, which were famously warmer and more relaxed than anything you'd find at Buckingham Palace. It was said that the wine flowed as freely as the conversation, and neither were particularly short on volume. His favorite drink? Reports vary. He was known to indulge in brandy, fortified wine, and sweet liqueurs, but he was most often associated with champagne, which he seemed to view not as a luxury, but a necessity, like clean socks or punctuation. Unlike his stricter siblings, Augustus had no qualms about breaking rules, especially royal ones. He fell in love with a commoner, Lady Augusta Murray, and married her in secret in Rome in 1793. The union was immediately declared invalid under the Royal Marriages Act, but Augustus didn't care. He stayed with her for years, fathered children with her, and only reluctantly distanced himself when pressure from the crown became unbearable. This defiance, paired with his liberal leanings and open lifestyle, made Augustus a kind of black sheep within the family. But unlike his brother Ernest, whose defiance was soaked in menace, Augustus's was coated in sugar, wit, and wine. He didn't try to start fights, he tried to finish bottles. By middle age, Augustus had cultivated a full-fledged reputation as the intellectual rebel of the royal household. He was elected president of the Royal Society, became a patron of anti-slavery groups, supported Catholic emancipation, and, despite his high birth, aligned himself publicly with democratic ideals. These weren't just gestures. He gave speeches, he wrote letters, he challenged convention, all while nursing a glass of Madeira and engaging in hour-long debates about liberty. One might be tempted to imagine him as a sort of sober philosopher prince, but the reality, according to those who knew him, was far more indulgent. He drank frequently, sometimes from the moment he woke, often through long dinners and into the quiet hours of the morning. His health suffered. His waistline ballooned. By the time he was in his 50s, he was reportedly carried between rooms by staff when his gout flared up, possibly from drink, certainly not helped by it. Still, he refused to curtail his habits. He threw lavish parties. He laughed loudly. He collected one of the largest private libraries in Britain. And yes, he drank through it all. His death in 1843 was quiet, without fanfare. He left behind no heirs that the monarchy recognized, no military victories, no sweeping reforms with his name etched into law. But his influence was oddly enduring. He had, for lack of a better term, softened the edges of monarchy. He proved that a royal could be educated, liberal-minded, even progressive, without necessarily burning the whole institution to the ground, or sobering up. And in a family line full of violent drunks, angry exiles, and tyrannical eccentrics, Augustus stood out simply by being pleasant and pleasantly soused. He was the royal who offered you a drink before you even sat down, then politely disagreed with your politics for 3 hours without ever raising his voice, or his glass too far from his lips. But the royal bar tab wasn't closing yet. As Augustus toasted equality, the next generation was preparing to toast everything else. Because coming down the gilded hallway was a future king who would redefine Edwardian indulgence, starting with wine, cigars, and a lifetime of hungover diplomacy. 16. King Edward VII, England. By the time Edward VII finally ascended the throne in 1901, he was 59 years old, overweight, fashionably dressed, and already drunk on decades of delayed responsibility. The son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Edward had spent most of his life waiting to rule, waiting to matter, waiting for his mother to die so he could stop pretending to be a footnote and start acting like a headline. And in the meantime, he drank. Oh, did he drink? Before he became king, he was simply Bertie, a name that sounds like a minor character in a Woodhouse novel, and not entirely by accident. He was known for his impeccable manners, his extravagant appetites, and his ability to outlast nearly any dinner guest in cigars, wine, or conversation. He was polite, courteous, scandalous, and constantly sipping something. Whether it was port, claret, champagne, or one of his personal favorites, a concoction called a Morning Glory Fizz, which included scotch, absinthe, and raw egg. It was not named for subtlety. He belonged to a class of royals for whom alcohol wasn't a vice. It was a setting. Drinking was simply what one did between meals, at state functions, after duels, during opera intermissions, and before discreet rendezvous in Parisian hotel suites. By the time Bertie was in his 30s, his reputation was sealed. He was the Prince of Wales, a monarch in waiting who was perpetually hung over in a frock coat. And no one could really stop him. His mother, Queen Victoria, tried. Repeatedly, she scolded, wrote letters, cut off allowances, and lectured him on moral responsibility. But Bertie, deeply aware that he would likely outlive her reign but never live during it, sank deeper into his social world of wine-fueled diplomacy, aristocratic affairs, and continental leisure. If he couldn't rule, he'd at least reign over the dinner table. He did so with skill. His feasts became legendary across Europe. 7-course meals, endless bottles, and a guest list that included emperors, mistresses, bankers, artists, generals, and anyone interesting enough to distract him from the shadow of his own throne. In France, he was worshipped. In Britain, he was whispered about. Even the Americans, who were supposed to be post-monarchical, couldn't get enough of his charm. But behind the silk waistcoats and baccarat glasses, there was a man drowning in expectation. His drinking was sophisticated, always, but also relentless. Reports from the time suggest he drank throughout the day, rarely appearing in public without a glass in hand. Breakfast? A light sparkling wine. Lunch? Claret and Burgundy. Dinner? Champagne, port, brandy. After dinner? Cognac or scotch. And through it all, endless cigars, often more than a dozen per day. He maintained a robust constitution well into his 50s, but by the end of the century, the toll was visible. He was bloated, often short of breath, and suffered from chronic bronchitis and digestive issues, not helped by his love of foie gras, rich game meats, and wine pairings that could drown a mid-sized yacht. And then Victoria died. At long last, in 1901, Bertie became King Edward VII, and in a moment so perfectly on brand, it might as well have been written by Oscar Wilde. His coronation had to be delayed because he overindulged and needed emergency surgery for appendicitis. The monarchy had returned to a man who lived like excess was his birthright. Yet as king, Edward surprised everyone. He wasn't a disaster. He wasn't even bad. He was effective. Behind the indulgence was a sharp diplomatic mind. Fluent in French, deeply connected across Europe, and always at the right dinners with the right people. He pioneered what became known as dinner table diplomacy, not as a metaphor, but literally. He built alliances through banquets. He charmed foreign leaders over brandy. He smoothed tensions with anecdotes and Bordeaux. It worked, until it didn't. By 1910, his health was crumbling. He was plagued by coughing fits, heart disease, and the cumulative consequences of 5 decades of uninterrupted feasting. When doctors begged him to reduce his intake, he dismissed them with the same wry wit he used on mistresses and prime ministers. I have tried moderation and found it disappointing. He died that same year, after a brief illness that he insisted on ignoring. He attended a horse race while coughing up blood, returned home, had a stroke, and, within days, was gone. The man who had drunk his way through dynasties, dalliances, and diplomacy had finally run out of breath. But his legacy lingered. Edward VII was the monarch who turned indulgence into political strategy, who elevated dinner into diplomacy, and who proved that charm, when paired with champagne, could hold a fractured empire together, if only for a little while. And yet, even he was not the last royal to find solace, escape, and identity at the bottom of a glass. Because tucked behind the Navy medals and foreign tours of his younger brother was a prince who carried his bottle quietly. Until one day, he didn't. 17. Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh. If King Edward VII turned drinking into diplomacy, then his younger brother Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, turned it into something closer to survival. Alfred wasn't flashy like Bertie. He wasn't charming. He didn't court scandal. He didn't throw banquets for European heads of state or lounge in the public imagination as a decadent socialite. But behind the naval uniform and the heavy medals was a man slowly undone by the same aristocratic curse: boredom, pressure, and an endless supply of good liquor. Born in 1844, Prince Alfred was the second son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, the spare behind Bertie's all-consuming role as heir to the throne. And like so many second sons before him, Alfred was quickly packed off to the Royal Navy, presumably to keep him out of trouble and out of Parliament. What followed was a decades-long naval career, marked by steady promotions, increasing isolation, and a growing dependence on alcohol that became the Royal Navy's worst-kept secret. He joined the service at age 12 and was made a midshipman just a year later. Early reports were promising. He was competent, dutiful, and less rebellious than his older brother. But the novelty wore off quickly. Unlike Bertie, who seemed to find joy in defying expectations, Alfred simply disappeared into uniform, dutifully moving through the ranks without ever really emerging as a public figure of interest. He traveled extensively: India, Australia, South Africa, the Mediterranean, and eventually took command of his own vessel. But the deeper he drifted into naval life, the more his officers began to whisper about his heavy drinking. At first, it was explained away: long voyages, hard work, naval tradition. After all, this was a time when rum was part of standard rations and morale was maintained with a bottle, not a therapist. But Alfred didn't just drink like a sailor. He drank like a man trying to forget he was a prince. His colleagues were discreet, but not blind. Accounts from naval officers stationed with Alfred describe a commanding officer who was frequently inebriated, particularly during long stints at sea. His behavior didn't veer into chaos, it simply dulled. He became withdrawn, moody, slow to respond in meetings, and occasionally erratic during official duties. At diplomatic functions, he could be either overly formal or strangely detached, depending on how far into the wine list the evening had progressed. His drinking was tolerated because, frankly, what else was there for him to do? He was not the heir. He was not the rebel. He was a professional prince who'd been handed a lifetime appointment in a naval machine that had little room for creativity or leadership from the aristocracy. Even his naval promotions, which were frequent, came with asterisks. Behind the scenes, his superiors quietly adjusted his responsibilities to account for his condition. In 1866, at just 22, Alfred was made Duke of Edinburgh, granting him a title to go along with the rank. But with it came more ceremonial obligations, more diplomatic tours, more functions that ended with brandy, and more pressure to act like he was perfectly fine when everyone around him knew he wasn't. He married Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia in 1874, a political alliance more than a romantic match. She didn't care for English customs. He didn't care for Russian ones. And their household quickly settled into a cold rhythm: formal dinners, awkward correspondence, and, on Alfred's part, increasing isolation and drinking behind closed doors. As his naval career ended, Alfred transitioned into administrative and ceremonial roles. In 1893, he unexpectedly became Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha after the death of his childless uncle, bringing him into a small German duchy he barely knew and a population that barely cared. There, he ruled with minimal enthusiasm and a cellar that reportedly grew larger each year. By the time he neared the end of his life, his health was failing. His drinking had long since passed the point of quiet coping. Letters from German officials hinted at concern over his persistent private habits, while British diplomats tactfully avoided the subject altogether. His marriage had fractured, his court was formal but lifeless, and his children, one by one, had either died, disappeared into scandal, or distanced themselves. In 1900, his son, also named Alfred, died suddenly, an event surrounded by rumors of addiction and emotional collapse. The elder Alfred never fully recovered. Already weakened by years of alcohol-related illness, he withdrew further into himself, reportedly refusing visitors and allowing his staff to run most of the duchy. When he died in July of that same year, the public barely reacted. A few brief obituaries, a few flags at half-mast, and then silence. Prince Alfred's story is not one of collapse, but of slow erosion, the kind of royal life that vanishes not with scandal, but with the gentle clinking of glass in the background. He wasn't hated, he wasn't celebrated. He simply drank his way through one of the most privileged lives in Europe and somehow still managed to vanish into the wallpaper of history. But what's perhaps most tragic is that his son may have inherited more than his name. The next prince in our chain didn't have his father's stoic detachment, but he did have his pain, and his bottle, and his reasons. 18. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany. In a royal family overflowing with boisterous brothers, scandalous uncles, and brandy-soaked patriarchs, Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, might seem like the quiet one, the serious one, the tragic one. Born in 1853 as the youngest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Leopold was intelligent, sensitive, artistic, less interested in military uniforms than in books, philosophy, and conversation. But under the surface of this well-read, fragile prince was a more complicated truth. Leopold drank, not flamboyantly or socially, but strategically, as a way to blunt the chronic pain that defined his short, haunted life. Because unlike many of his royal relatives, Leopold didn't start drinking for pleasure. He drank to function. Diagnosed in early childhood with hemophilia, a rare genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly, Leopold grew up in the shadow of risk. A simple fall could be deadly. A bruise could become a hemorrhage. An injury might lead to weeks of confinement, agony, and the ever-present threat of death. In a family known for demanding physical vigor, moral strictness, and public duty, Leopold was the one who had to sit out the games. Literally. Queen Victoria adored him, but in that suffocating way that turned affection into control. She saw his illness not only as a medical crisis, but as a reason to keep him cloistered, protected, limited. She worried he would die young, and so she kept him close. Always close. Too close. But Leopold wanted more, and pain doesn't care about royal titles. As a teenager, he began to seek out treatments, some sanctioned, some quietly improvised, and in the 19th century, treatment often meant alcohol. Doctors frequently prescribed port wine, brandy, and sherry as tonics for blood disorders, nerve conditions, and delicate constitutions. To be a prince with hemophilia in Victorian England was to be surrounded by men in waistcoats pouring you a glass of fortified wine and calling it medicine. So Leopold began to drink. Quietly, methodically, and over time, he came to depend on it, not just for physical relief, but for emotional insulation. Because pain, especially chronic pain, is isolating. And when your mother is the Queen Empress of a global empire, and your brothers are ruling Germany or climbing naval ranks, or passing out in Paris, being left behind hurts almost as much as the illness itself. He was educated at Oxford, where he was admired for his intellect and wit. He formed friendships with leading thinkers, joined literary societies, and tried to carve out a life that wasn't defined by royal ceremony or medical despair. But throughout his 20s, his health worsened, and so did his dependence on wine and spirits. Not in public, never in public, but in the privacy of his rooms, among trusted aides and sympathetic physicians, Leopold's drinking became a familiar rhythm. And those rhythms deepened as the pressure mounted. His mother refused to allow him a full-time position in the government or military, fearing the strain would kill him. She tried to block his attempts to travel, to marry, even to attend long public functions. And so Leopold, increasingly frustrated with being treated like a ghost prince, did what many do under pressure. He pushed back, and then he numbed the consequences. When he finally convinced his mother to let him marry, Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont in 1882, it seemed like a turning point. He was 29, finally building his own household, trying to create something resembling independence. But behind the scenes, his health continued to deteriorate. His mobility was limited. He suffered regular bleeds, muscle pain, and exhaustion. And the only thing that seemed to bring temporary relief? The brandy decanter beside his bed. In 1884, while traveling in Cannes to seek relief from the English winter, again unsanctioned by Victoria, he slipped and fell. The resulting internal bleeding proved fatal. He was just 30 years old. The royal family mourned, but also quietly closed the chapter. There was no scandal, no headlines, just a gentle retreat from memory. His daughter Alice, born posthumously, would grow up never knowing her father. Queen Victoria never forgave herself for letting him go abroad. And the public, already weary of royal tragedy, moved on. But within palace walls, the memory of Leopold lingered, not as a cautionary tale, but as a private ache. He had tried to escape the narrow confines of duty and illness, had tried to assert himself, to love, to live, and he had done so while drinking through the agony, because no one, least of all his mother, could offer him anything better. His death became one more sad note in a long royal song of inherited pain. But the next royal in our list? Her relationship with alcohol wouldn't come from physical suffering. It would come from privilege, parties, and the deep, anxious silence that followed the music. Because some royal reputations drown in scandal. Others just disappear in champagne. 19. Princess Margaret of Connaught. In most royal lineages, there's always one figure who seems born to almost be a star, graced with beauty, charm, a hint of scandal, but swept sideways by duty before the plot really gets interesting. That was Princess Margaret of Connaught, the first royal bride of modern Europe's entangled 20th century, and a woman whose story exists mostly in the footnotes of other people's headlines. But look closer, especially at the years before her marriage, and what emerges is not just a poised princess, but someone whose reputation for elegance was matched by an often overlooked truth. Margaret could drink almost anyone under the table. Born in 1882, Margaret was Queen Victoria's granddaughter, and she inherited the full spectrum of that genetic inheritance. Duty-bound, graceful, photogenic, and quietly rebellious. She was the daughter of Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, and as such, grew up inside the maze of British aristocracy, complete with titled governesses, seasonal relocations, and dinner parties designed more for politics than pleasure. But unlike many of her royal cousins, Margaret developed something of a taste for European flair, especially when it came to her social life and her drinking habits. As a young adult, she quickly became known across the continent as a rising royal beauty, beloved for her composure, her intelligence, and her ability to hold court at high society gatherings with champagne in hand and perfectly timed sarcasm on her lips. She was smart, fashionable, and slightly sharper than most people expected her to be, which meant she wasn't always content with playing the quiet English princess at Parisian balls. By the early 1900s, Margaret had already turned down several high-profile marriage proposals, including, most famously, a match with the future King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy. She was less interested in crowns and more interested in conversation. And cocktails. Reports from contemporaries, some dry, others delighted, describe Margaret as having a continental sensibility, which is coded aristocratic language for she partied like a French duchess. Unlike her English relatives, who still clung to Victorian teetotalism in public, Margaret moved through social circles that were far more fluid. Paris, Monte Carlo, Vienna, where pre-dinner drinks were expected, wine flowed freely at luncheons, and no one blinked if a young royal lady enjoyed her champagne before noon. She wasn't reckless, she wasn't scandalous, But she drank with the kind of effortless frequency that made even seasoned courtiers raise an eyebrow. It was whispered that she could match her male guests in every toast, and then still rise at 8 the next morning with gloves, hat, and curtsies in place. There were stories, always told with a smile, about the time she sipped her way through a Viennese ball, only to outdance the Austrian ambassadors and outwit half the men at the after-party. What's notable, though, is that Margaret's drinking wasn't framed, then or now, as self-destruction. It was style, identity, a subtle power move in a society that expected women, especially royal ones, to be ornamental, quiet, and very well hydrated with water only. Margaret was none of those things. She was social, lively, and liked her wine list to be as extensive as her guest list. And then, in 1905, everything changed. That year, she married Prince Gustav Adolf of Sweden, heir to the Swedish throne. It was a dynastic match, born of diplomacy, but surprisingly happy. She became Crown Princess of Sweden, and her life shifted almost overnight from lively European debutante to royal consort in a much stricter, colder, more formal court. And with that shift, the drinking stopped being fun. Sweden at the time was heavily Protestant, tightly moralistic, and deeply uncomfortable with the kind of continental indulgences Margaret had once embraced. She adjusted, of course, she was royal, but the tone of her social life changed dramatically. Gone were the long evenings in Paris salons. Gone were the late lunches in Nice with chilled white wine and whispered court gossip. In Stockholm, she became the good wife, the devoted mother, the queen-in-waiting, and though she remained popular and effective in her new role, the sparkle that had defined her earlier years dimmed. But according to letters from former friends and aides, she never entirely gave it up. Even in Sweden, Margaret maintained her private habits. A quiet drink before dinner, a well-stocked cellar tucked away from prying eyes, and the occasional long evening when the crown's weight was slightly softened by brandy from France. She died young, just 38 years old, in 1920, from an infection following surgery while pregnant with her 6th child. Her death shocked the Swedish public and devastated her family. The press mourned her as a model of royal femininity, but those who knew her best remembered the wit, the laughter, and the woman who had once made royal cocktail hours a form of performance art. Margaret didn't make headlines. She didn't collapse in public or feud with Parliament. But she lived in the subtle space between responsibility and rebellion. A royal woman who drank not to escape, not to suffer, but to define herself in a world built to contain her. And as the century turned darker, the royals who came after her would lose that balance. They wouldn't sip, they would plunge, turning their titles into shields for habits that became harder to hide. Because the next one in line? He abdicated more than just a throne. He abdicated moderation itself. 20. King Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. For most royals, alcohol is a detail. A footnote in a biography, a companion at dinner, a quiet indulgence behind closed doors. For Edward VIII, later the Duke of Windsor, it was more than that. It was a lifestyle, a compass, a coping mechanism. It was, in many ways, the most consistent thing in a life built on emotional evasion and grand gestures that rarely went deeper than the surface of a cocktail glass. When he abdicated the throne in 1936, becoming the first British monarch in modern history to voluntarily surrender the crown, Edward didn't just give up power. He gave up responsibility. He gave up purpose. And then, like any man untethered from the weight of expectation, he grabbed the nearest glass and started filling the void. But his relationship with alcohol began long before the crisis. It began in youth, like it often does in aristocratic circles, where drinking wasn't seen as vice, but as initiation. Edward was born in 1894, raised in the shadow of rigid Victorian morality, but surrounded by Edwardian opulence. From the moment he could walk, he was placed in uniforms, paraded before courtiers, and told to be something he had no interest in becoming. So, by the time he reached adolescence, he was already developing what you might call a soft rebellion, private irreverence masked by public charm, and alcohol fit right in. As the Prince of Wales, Edward was adored. The public saw a modern prince, handsome, athletic, cosmopolitan, and more accessible than the stiff Windsors who came before him. But behind the camera flashes and fashionable suits was a young man drowning in performative expectation. He smiled because it was safer than speaking. He traveled endlessly to avoid staying still, and in nearly every foreign port or social gathering, there was alcohol waiting, poured by courtiers, diplomats, and socialites who wanted to impress the air. He drank to loosen up, to entertain, to mask discomfort. It was never messy, it was never scandalous, but it was constant. Friends noted that Edward never really got drunk. He just stayed in a kind of permanent buzz. Not fully in the room, not fully out of it, just suspended in a haze of champagne receptions and cognac-laced anecdotes. Then came Wallis Simpson. Meeting Wallis didn't introduce Edward to alcohol. If anything, it just gave his habits new purpose. Their relationship, scandalous and world-shaking in its day, unfolded like a martini-soaked novella. They met in the glittering social circles of pre-war London, where cocktails flowed more freely than truth, and where the Prince of Wales could still pretend his personal life wasn't a constitutional crisis in slow motion. Together, Edward and Wallis became an inseparable social unit. They didn't just attend parties, they curated them. Their gatherings were legendary for their glamour, their exclusivity, and their bottomless bars. Even as the political storm clouds gathered, the couple threw dinners, attended soirees, and lived like the abdication would never happen. But it did. And when it did, the party didn't end. It just moved. To France, then to the Bahamas, then into permanent exile. After 1936, Edward was no longer a king. He was the Duke of Windsor, a title soaked in irony and resentment. He had given up everything for Wallis, his country, his crown, his role in history, and what he got in return was a passport, a pension, and a lifetime of increasingly hollow dinner parties. And through it all, alcohol. In Paris, where they lived most of their post-abdication years, the Windsors maintained the facade of royal dignity. But their life was, by most accounts, a long, slow social unraveling. Friends came and went. Dinners got repetitive. Wallis grew bitter. Edward grew aimless. And the one thing that stayed the same? The drinks. Guests described the Windsor household as eternally lubricated. There were cocktails at noon, wine at lunch, aperitifs at 5, champagne at dinner, and brandy well into the night. The Duke wasn't destructive. He wasn't even particularly loud, but he was always drinking. One biographer noted that he was rarely fully sober and rarely fully drunk. He existed in a kind of suspended performance. There were moments when the mask slipped, in interviews, in private letters. Edward confessed feelings of uselessness, of being forgotten, of having no real role except to be the former king who walked away. And so he drank. Because that's what you do when you've built your entire identity on charm, and you no longer have anyone to charm but the same dinner guests you saw last week. He died in 1972, still married to Wallis, still exiled, still performing. The royal family attended the funeral out of duty, not sentiment. And when it was over, the world quietly turned the page. But Edward's story lingers, not as a king who ruled, but as a man who ran. From responsibility, from discomfort, from silence. And like so many royals before and after, He ran straight into the arms of a drink that never asked him any hard questions. The next in line didn't get to run. He was born into tragedy, raised on protocol, and drank not to escape duty, but to survive it. Because the monarchy's darkest secrets aren't always behind palace walls, they're sometimes hiding in the quiet addictions of men expected to smile for the camera. 21. George, Duke of Kent. In the royal family, some members are born to rule, others are born to support. And some, like George, Duke of Kent, are born to vanish, to slip between the cracks of duty and indulgence, caught in the slow-motion collapse of aristocratic expectations. He was polished, fashionable, soft-spoken, and famously handsome. A royal who moved through 20th century high society like a whispered scandal, always slightly too elegant to pin down, and always, quietly, drinking more than anyone dared to mention aloud. Born in 1902, George was the fourth son of King George V and Queen Mary. That meant he had a title, a budget, and zero pressure to inherit the throne. It also meant he had plenty of time, too much really, to figure out who he was supposed to be. Spoiler, he never quite did. From the start, George was different. While his older brothers, Edward, later Edward VIII, and Albert, later George VI, were being trained to carry the empire, or, in Edward's case, flee from it, George seemed to exist in the margins. He was bookish, charming, musically inclined, and famously drawn to the arts. He also had an uncanny ability to show up wherever the fun was, whether that meant a London nightclub, a Parisian jazz salon, or a Mediterranean yacht party hosted by someone with a suspicious number of aliases. This was the 1920s, after all, a decade built for excess. And George, with his royal name and impeccable tailoring, fit right in. The press loved him. Aristocrats adored him. Artists and intellectuals kept inviting him to things. He was the kind of prince who didn't need to speak loudly to command attention. He just needed to be there, leaning on a piano, drink in hand, eyes half closed, smiling like he knew something you didn't. And yes, that drink was usually something strong. He drank like a man who had nowhere particular to be. In private circles, it was common knowledge that George could outlast most of his companions. His liquor cabinet followed him from palace to palace, and his staff quickly learned how to read his moods by how early the first bottle was opened. He didn't drink publicly. He drank socially, constantly, elegantly. It was never a scene, just a presence. Just one more cocktail, one more toast, one more glass in the hand of a man who always seemed a few degrees removed from whatever was happening around him. But what made George's drinking more than a royal footnote was what it was paired with: a deep, unresolved anxiety about identity. He was a royal, but he hated the constraints. He was a military officer, but not a natural soldier. He was married, dutifully, to Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, but carried on a complex network of friendships and affairs that blurred every conventional line. Rumors swirled around him constantly. Some were exaggerated, some weren't. Through it all, alcohol became a kind of ritual armor, a way to manage the pressures of being both highly visible and emotionally invisible. By the 1930s, George had settled into a strange dual life. On one hand, he was performing royal duties, cutting ribbons, attending state functions, occasionally giving speeches with practiced elegance. On the other, he was spiraling deeper into a private world of late-night parties, addictive behaviors, and what friends described as a growing dependence on drink. When World War II broke out, George, like many royals, joined the war effort. He re-enlisted in the Royal Navy and later transferred to the Royal Air Force. It was, by all accounts, a genuine attempt to find meaning. But behind the uniform, the habits persisted. Pilots who served with him noted his charisma, but also his mood swings, his detachment, and his need to unwind with something stronger than tea. And then, suddenly, he was gone. In 1942, at the age of just 39, George died in a mysterious plane crash in Scotland. The circumstances were strange. The aircraft, a Sunderland flying boat, was not designed for the terrain it crashed into. The purpose of the flight remains murky. Some say he was on a morale tour. Others suggest something more clandestine. The official inquiry produced no satisfying answers. What is known is that George left behind a widow, 3 young children, and a string of half-told stories about what kind of man he really was. His death was tragic, but also oddly fitting. An abrupt end to a life that had always felt more like a ghost note than a melody. Today, George, Duke of Kent, is remembered in fragments. A statue here, a naval base there, the occasional photograph of a dashing man in uniform with a cigarette in one hand and a cocktail in the other. He was the royal who never quite settled into his skin, the brother overshadowed by abdication and stuttering, the prince who tried to drink away the question, what happens when you're not needed but still watched? And coming up next, another brother, another duke. This one didn't disappear in a plane crash. He just drank himself quietly into history, leaving behind a trail of whispers and worry that no one wanted to put in the papers. 22. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester. If George, Duke of Kent, was the mysterious brother, the one with the shadows and the crash and the legends, then Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, was the one the family didn't talk about at all. Not because he caused a scandal, not because he courted the press, but because he was deeply unremarkable. Or at least, that's how it seemed. In reality, Henry's life was a slow-motion unraveling, the kind that doesn't make headlines but fills volumes of internal reports. He drank. Quietly. Consistently. For decades. And he did it while wearing a uniform, shaking hands, and trying very hard not to look like he was falling apart. Born in 1900, Henry was the 3rd son of King George V and Queen Mary, and perhaps the most forgotten of the trio. Edward was the charismatic one. Albert, later George VI, was the duty-bound one. George, the Duke of Kent, was the stylish, enigmatic one. And Henry? Henry was the one who did what he was told, until he couldn't anymore. His childhood was the standard royal mix of formality and repression. Nannies, uniforms, discipline. Emotion was not part of the curriculum. Neither was vulnerability. From a young age, Henry was taught the value of silence, of duty, of keeping things in. It worked for a time. He passed through Eton, Sandhurst, and into the army without fanfare. He served in the King's Royal Rifle Corps, performing his duties with adequate precision and absolute invisibility. But Henry was not built for public life. He wasn't charismatic, wasn't comfortable with speeches, and hated the camera. He seemed painfully aware that he lacked the polish and poise of his older brothers. And so, like many men trapped in roles they didn't ask for and couldn't escape, he turned to alcohol. It wasn't dramatic. There were no public outbursts, no smashed glasses at Buckingham Palace. Henry's drinking was quiet, chronic, and corrosive. A little whiskey after lunch, a few more in the evening, and eventually an unspoken understanding among his staff. Keep his schedule light, avoid morning events, and never ask questions if he's under the weather. His marriage in 1935 to Lady Alice Montague Douglas Scott was solid but never romantic. She was elegant, intelligent, and dignified, exactly the kind of woman the palace hoped would stabilize him. And for a time she did. She provided structure, normalcy. But even she, in later years, would admit that Henry was never really emotionally available, that something in him had been quietly broken long before they met. By the time World War II arrived, Henry's drinking was an open secret inside the palace walls. He was given ceremonial military roles, but he was increasingly viewed as unreliable. At one point, he was appointed Governor-General of Australia, a role that could have revitalized his standing, but even that came with caveats. Behind the scenes, officials in Canberra expressed concern about his health. Translation: the drinking. When he finally arrived in Australia in 1945, he made a decent impression at first, dignified, if stiff. But soon, the cracks appeared. He missed meetings, slurred occasionally at receptions. His aides began quietly rearranging schedules to avoid embarrassment. Lady Alice stepped in when necessary, always with grace, always covering. But the truth was hard to hide. Back in England, Henry resumed royal duties, but his relevance had faded. His brothers were dead. His niece Elizabeth was now queen. The new generation had no real role for him. He became, essentially, a ceremonial relic, wheeled out for events, photographed awkwardly, and then quietly returned to the background. And through it all, the drinking continued. It aged him prematurely. His face puffed. His skin yellowed. He began suffering from transient ischemic attacks, mini-strokes, and his doctors quietly blamed decades of alcohol abuse. By the late 1960s, he was barely functioning in public. In 1972, he suffered a major stroke that left him severely incapacitated. From then until his death in 1974, he lived in near total seclusion, unable to speak, unable to walk, and, most hauntingly, utterly forgotten by the public he had spent a lifetime serving with careful invisibility. No memoirs, no tributes, just silence. His death made modest headlines. The obituaries were brief, respectful, and vague. The royal family mourned with dutiful restraint. There were no retrospective think pieces, no probing documentaries, because Henry had left behind nothing controversial, nothing heroic, and nothing people wanted to remember. Just a file in the archives, a bottle behind a closed door, and a life defined not by disaster, but by quiet collapse. But sometimes the quietest collapses are the most haunting, because they ask the question that no one in the royal family ever wants to answer. What happens to the men who don't rebel, don't abdicate, don't crash planes, just fade? And if that sounds like a lull in the storm, it isn't. Because next came a woman who did everything Henry didn't. She drank, she danced, she dominated headlines, and she didn't fade. She sparked. She burned, and then she burned out, and she burned. 23. Princess Margaret, sister of Queen Elizabeth II. There are royal drinkers, and then there's Princess Margaret, a woman who didn't so much sip alcohol as swirl it theatrically into a lifestyle, a defiant gesture wrapped in diamonds and perfectly cut sarcasm. She was Queen Elizabeth II's younger sister, the original royal rebel, the reluctant supporting act to the longest-running show in monarchy. And when history decided her role would be ornamental, ceremonial, and quiet, Margaret reached for the bottle and turned the volume all the way up. Born in 1930, Margaret grew up as a royal in transition. Born into the rigid, suffocating traditions of pre-war aristocracy, but coming of age in a post-war Britain that wanted its royals to smile more and mean less. From the outside, she looked like the modern princess, glamorous, beautiful, witty, and beloved by the tabloids. But from the inside, she was a woman boxed in from the moment her uncle abdicated, making her father king and her sister queen. And her? She became the royal spare with nowhere to go but sideways. She wasn't supposed to drink like she did, or smoke like she did, or fall in love like she did. But she did all three, with precision, charm, and a growing edge of self-destruction. Margaret's drinking began socially, as most royal indulgences do. In the post-war years, she was young, photogenic, and constantly being invited to parties, clubs, and art openings. She mixed with painters, poets, actors, and jazz musicians, many of whom were delighted to find that the Queen's younger sister could match them round for round at Soho bars and Mayfair dinners. She had her own routine. Breakfast in bed at 9 a.m., often accompanied by a cigarette and a pick-me-up, usually a blend of orange juice and vodka. A light lunch with wine, afternoon cocktails, dinner with multiple courses of vintage wine, followed by several rounds of scotch or port. And then, if the night called for it, and it often did, champagne until she couldn't keep her eyes open. But Margaret's drinking was never just about fun. It was also armor. A way to soften the lifelong frustration of being close to power, but never in it. She couldn't marry Group Captain Peter Townsend, the divorcee she loved, because the Crown and the Church said no. She couldn't have a real job. She couldn't leave. She couldn't disappear. But she could drink, and she could laugh, especially at the things she wasn't allowed to feel out loud. And oh, how she laughed. Her wit was legendary. Margaret could disarm a room with a sentence. She once told a foreign ambassador, "I'm not the Queen. I'm just one of the untouchables." At a high society event, she was asked if she enjoyed working with charities. She replied, "Yes, they're often full of alcohol." Behind the velvet curtain of royal formality, she was more Noel Coward than Windsor, but underneath the dry humor was something far more bitter. The 1960s and 70s brought more strain. Her marriage to photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, Lord Snowdon, began with flair and ended with fireworks. Both were unfaithful. Both were temperamental. Both drank. A lot. Their home in Kensington Palace was filled with stylish chaos. Art, arguments, and the clink of glasses echoing down marble halls. The tabloids devoured their lives like serialized fiction. And through it all, Margaret's drinking deepened, becoming less a performance and more a dependency. By the 1980s, it was no longer funny. She began to fall ill more often, suffered from migraines, exhaustion, and mood swings. Her once sparkling social calendar became more erratic. She was hospitalized multiple times. She smoked heavily, drank daily, and grew increasingly isolated, holding court at Mustique, her private island retreat, where the beach parties got quieter and the mornings got harder to face. Even her family began to worry. Behind palace walls, discussions were had. Attempts were made, gently of course, to suggest moderation. But Margaret was too proud, too angry, and too royal to be told what to do. Especially by a family who had, in her view, spent her whole life treating her like a decorative afterthought. In 1998, she suffered a stroke. It left her partially paralyzed, unable to walk without assistance. Still, she drank. In 2000, another stroke. Then more health issues. By the end, Margaret, the once golden girl of the royal family, was frail, withdrawn, and haunted by the image of who she used to be. She died in 2002, just 71 years old. Her funeral was quiet, dignified, respectful. The Queen sat alone in grief. The world reflected for a moment on the sparkle that had dimmed. But Margaret's real legacy isn't in the ceremony, it's in the contradiction. The princess who could light up a room with a joke, then drink alone in it hours later. The royal who toasted to everything she couldn't have. The woman who made luxury look effortless, until the effort became too much. And the monarchy moved on. But the drinking didn't stop. Because even in the most modern era, under the gaze of paparazzi and press secretaries, there was still a prince who followed the old pattern: duty, silence, grief, and a bottle to hide in when the rest didn't work. 24. Prince William of Gloucester. In a family where protocol often smothers personality, Prince William of Gloucester stood out. not because he defied the crown, but because he seemed to forget it was even there. Athletic, adventurous, and unnervingly normal for a Windsor, he was the golden boy who wanted something more than titles and ceremonies. He wanted freedom, speed, danger, and, in quieter, less public moments, alcohol. Not in the decadent, champagne-drenched fashion of past royals, but in a subtler, more destructive way. The quiet dependency that follows people who never quite slow down. Born in 1941, Prince William was the eldest son of Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and thus a first cousin of Queen Elizabeth II. He grew up inside the cocoon of royalty, palace walls, royal tutors, and dinners filled with silverware rules, but never really embraced it. From an early age, he showed signs of wanting something different. While his cousins were practicing wave etiquette, William was building model airplanes, racing around estates, and dreaming of escape. That desire only deepened with age. After attending Eton and then Cambridge, William headed to Stanford for graduate studies, a rare move for a royal at the time, and one that exposed him to a whole new world, California in the 1960s. There, he found something intoxicating that wasn't in a glass: independence. He could blend in, explore, be just Bill to his classmates. But also, perhaps inevitably, he drank. Those who knew him during those years described a man who could be the life of the party or the one nursing a whiskey alone. He wasn't reckless, but he was restless. A classic functioning drinker, the kind who never seemed drunk, but was rarely sober either. Back in Britain, whispers began to circulate about his lifestyle. The racing, the flying, the late nights, and the drinking that was no longer occasional. His return to royal duties came reluctantly. He joined the diplomatic corps and was posted to Tokyo, where he impressed colleagues with his intelligence and charm. But again, there were rumors of long nights, of social functions that ended with slurred goodbyes, of a man trying to live two lives, the prince and the man he might have been if he'd been born anonymous. He was, at all times, a contradiction, polished and disheveled, dutiful and defiant. He dated a woman considered unsuitable by royal standards, Zuzi Starkloff, a glamorous, twice-divorced Hungarian-American model. The press called it scandalous. William didn't care. He wanted to marry her. The royal family did not approve. Neither did the court. And so, like so many royals before him, he stood on the edge of personal happiness, holding a glass in one hand and expectations in the other. His love of flying became his defining passion, and ultimately, his death sentence. On August 28, 1972, at just 30 years old, William died in a fiery crash during an amateur air race in Gloucestershire. He had been piloting his own aircraft, pushing the limits of his abilities. Some speculated about engine failure. Others quietly asked whether he had been fit to fly that day. The official report was inconclusive. The whispers weren't. His death sent shockwaves through the royal family. He had been young, promising, and just rebellious enough to be interesting. Queen Elizabeth reportedly took it hard. Privately, there was grief. Publicly, there was silence. But in his short life, Prince William embodied a newer kind of royal tragedy. The kind that didn't explode in scandal, but eroded in quiet, slow, habitual indulgence. He wasn't flamboyant. He wasn't careless. He just drank to dull the friction between who he was and who he was supposed to be. And after his death, that friction didn't go away. It just passed down quietly to another prince. One who would grow up in a different world, more visible, more scrutinized, more modern, but who would find himself reaching for the same coping mechanism. Only this time, the world watched. 25. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. It would be comforting to imagine that by the 21st century the British royal family had left its drinking problem behind. That lessons had been learned, patterns broken, and the ghosts of port-soaked palaces laid to rest. But then there's Prince Harry, a child born into the wreckage of tabloid obsession, global attention, and royal dysfunction. and for a time before the podcasts, the memoir, and the California reinvention, he coped the same way many before him did, with alcohol. Born in 1984, Prince Harry arrived into the world already defined by contrast. The spare to William's heir, the cheeky one, the fun one, the wild card. While William bore the weight of future kingship, Harry was given something both more dangerous and more alluring: freedom without direction. And when his mother, Princess Diana, died in 1997, killed in a car crash while being chased by paparazzi, the narrative hardened. William would be the strong one. Harry would be the broken one. The media ran with it. The family did what they always do, buried it in silence. But grief doesn't vanish. It festers, especially in a 12-year-old boy forced to walk behind his mother's coffin in front of the world. Especially in a system where showing emotion is discouraged, and where therapy is for the weak. So Harry did what many in his lineage had done before him. He masked it, first with laughter, then with mischief, and then with alcohol. In his teens and 20s, Harry's drinking became a fixture of tabloid culture. He was photographed leaving clubs in the early hours, eyes glazed, shirt untucked. He partied in Las Vegas, got caught on camera naked, and was nicknamed everything from Dirty Harry to the Party Prince. The public laughed, the palace winced, but beneath the headlines was a man spiraling. In interviews and later in his memoir, Spare, Harry admitted to using alcohol as a coping mechanism for unprocessed trauma. He described drinking heavily, sometimes nightly, to numb himself, to silence the chaos, to create distance from the grief and the rage and the confusion that followed him like a private storm. He wasn't drinking for fun, he was drinking to disappear. And the institution? It watched, silently, as it always had. In the army, Harry found structure, but not peace. He served with distinction in Afghanistan, but the war followed him home. The drinking worsened. At public events, he appeared charming and affable. Privately, he was cracking. And in the most royal of ironies, it wasn't until he left the palace walls, physically and emotionally, that the healing began. Therapy, sobriety, confronting the trauma. Prince Harry became, for the first time in Windsor history, a royal who said it out loud, who acknowledged the damage, who connected the dots between grief, silence, and the glass in his hand. He didn't just break the cycle, he named it. But the story doesn't end with recovery, it ends with reflection. Harry's drinking was part of a legacy centuries deep, a royal lineage filled with emotional suppression, impossible expectations, and an uninterrupted stream of well-dressed, well-educated, profoundly lonely people who reached for the bottle because no one ever taught them what else to reach for. And that's what lingers. Not the headlines, or the scandals, or the laughter. But the question, what if this wasn't about bad behavior? What if it was just the only way they knew how to bleed in public without getting punished for it? Harry escaped. Most didn't. And the royal wine cellar, it turns out, has always been full, not just with bottles, but with ghosts.